Good morning, boys and girls. I'm Miss Bonnie, and I teach first, second, and third graders at Alabama Baptist Church. I've missed all of my Sunday school kids for the past several weeks, and I sure will be glad when we can get back to church together. Since I didn't have any of you around, I brought some of my friends to sit with me today. I have some rabbits over here, and a pound puppy, and teddy bears. But they are special, and they are my security blanket. Sometimes we need a security blanket. When you think of this time of year at Easter time, what are things that come to your mind? Do you think about dying Easter eggs, an Easter basket, rabbits, perhaps the flowers blooming? And some of the younger ones, sometimes you have an Easter parade and you may wear a hat. Occasionally, Miss Bonnie will wear a hat to church, and Easter is a Sunday you might see hats at church, and especially little girls like to wear. But we're going to talk about what Easter really is all about. Those are things that we have started doing through the years, but we're going to learn about the first Easter and the days before Jesus was crucified. Jesus and his disciples were headed to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover festival. And many people had heard Jesus teach. They had seen him perform miracles. And as they walked along, people began to recognize Jesus and the disciples that were with him. And most of the people were headed to Jerusalem themselves because they were going for the Passover. And they began to share the news, and they were shouting to the people down the road, Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. And the men would take off their cloak, and they would put their cloak on the ground, and Jesus was riding a donkey, and they could walk over the cloaks. That's sort of what they did for important people like kings. And then the people began to break branches off the trees, and they waved them in the air, and they said, Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. They were so happy and remembered many good things about Jesus. And as they got nearer to Jerusalem, some of them remembered the words of the prophets and that had written a long time before. And they said a king would come riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. So here was the king, they thought. Later that week, Jesus had his disciples go into Jerusalem and prepare a room for their Passover feast. And that evening they went to the room to have the meal together. And as they ate and talked, Jesus said, one of you is going to help my enemies to catch me. You're going to betray me. The disciples were horrified by what they heard, and they began to look at one another. They thought, I'm not betraying him. Is it Peter? Is it John? Andrew? Bartholomew? Who is it? They didn't notice that Judas had slowly and quietly slipped out the door, and he was going to tell the priest how they could catch Jesus. After the meal, Jesus and his disciples went to up a nearby hill to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus had his disciples to stop, and he said, I want to go further in the garden alone so that I can pray. And so the disciples waited on the hillside, and Jesus went and prayed, and he talked to God, and he knew what was going to be happening to him. He knew that he was going to die for us. And so when he finished praying, he started back down the hillside, and he came to where his disciples were, and guess what? His disciples were all asleep. He was disappointed that they had fallen asleep, but he woke them up, and as they were talking and heading down the hill, they heard a noisy crowd coming, and they saw it was soldiers, and they had their swords with them, and they had torches that were lit because it was nighttime and they needed to see where they were going. And the disciples were looking and wondering what was happening, and they saw the leader of the group, and they thought, that's Judas. He's our friend. He's one of the disciples. But Judas had betrayed Jesus, and he had been paid 30 pieces of silver, and I have 30 pieces of silver in my dish here. And he told the soldiers and the priest, he said, I will take you to Jesus, and you will know who he is, because I will walk up to him and kiss him on the cheek, and then you can arrest him. And they came at Jesus with their swords drawn and all of that, but Jesus told them, you don't need your swords, I'll go with you. And he went with them. And that night they had a trial, and it was noisy, and the people were angry and wanted Jesus to be found guilty. But Jesus hasn't done anything wrong. He was the only person that lived a perfect life. But he was convicted, and the people were shouting, crucify him, crucify him. And the next day he was taken, and he was nailed to a cross. And the cross was placed in a hole on the hillside, and he hung there until he was dead. And so after he died, some friends of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, came and asked for his body because they wanted to give it a proper burial. And they took it to a tomb, and Joseph of Arimathea had bought this tomb, and it had never been used. And today we have a hole in the ground that we place a coffin in with a person's body. But this tomb was a cave dug in the side of the hill, and then when they buried the person in there, they rolled a big stone in front of the opening there. So Jesus was there for 3 days in that, but on Sunday, after he had died 3 days before, Mary Magdalene and another Mary got up real early in the morning, because there was a ritual that they had when people died. They placed spices on the body. So they were going to Jesus' tomb to do that. And it was dark as they left, and as they moved along, they talked about and remembered things that Jesus had done, the miracles he performed, how he fed 5,000, all of those things they talked about. And they were sad, and they thought, how are we going to move that big stone away from the tomb? And this is sort of what it might have looked like. And there was the cave in the hillside, and but what they noticed was the stone had been rolled away. So they looked inside, but there was the cloth that had been wrapped around his body, but there was no body. And they wondered, where could he be? Where could they have taken him? And they walked back outside, and they were looking around puzzled, and 2 men in dazzling white suddenly appeared right beside them, and they were terrified. They didn't know what was happening, but these men were angels, and they looked at him and they said, he is not here, but is risen. Don't you remember when he was among you that he said, I will be killed, but I will rise from the dead? And the women remembered, and they hurried back to where the disciples and the friends of Jesus were gathered, and they told them what they had seen and what the angels had said, and they were all shocked, and they weren't sure they would believe them. So they all hurried to the tomb where Jesus had been buried, and they saw that it was empty. And they could say, as the angels had told them, he is risen. And you can say the same thing on Easter Sunday. He is risen. And in our Bible, there are many verses that tell us about Jesus, his life, his death. And one of the verses I want to read to you is found in Romans 5:8, and it says, but God proves his own love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And then a favorite verse of mine, and I know some of you know it, is John 3:16, and it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And that's why we celebrate Easter. So let's say a prayer together. Dear Lord, thank you for this day, for your goodness to us. Thank you for sending Jesus, that he loved us and that he was willing to die for us, that we could learn about you, that we could grow to serve you. And we thank you that we can celebrate Easter Sunday. In your name we pray. Amen.